The medical training facility on Zalvex 9 was among the most advanced in the galaxy, a place where only the brightest minds from countless species gathered to study the art of healing. Its vast halls were lined with towering holographic displays showcasing the anatomy of creatures from distant worlds, from the gelatinous beings of Zephyron to the crystalline entities of the Novak system. But today, something unusual was happening. A sense of curiosity and unease rippled through the students as they filed into the lecture hall, their eyes drawn to a containment pod stationed at the center of the room. Inside, sitting casually with an expression of mild amusement, was a human. The professor, Dr. Exerol, a towering insectoid with multifaceted eyes, clicked his mandibles together and addressed the students. Today, we examine the most perplexing species in the known galaxy. This being, despite its unassuming appearance, has confounded medical science for centuries. You are here to understand why. The students leaned forward in interest, their datapads ready to record. Humans were a minor species in the grand scheme of the universe, not particularly strong, fast, or intelligent compared to other races. Yet they had spread across the stars, thriving in conditions that should have been fatal. The containment pod hissed open, and the human, clad in a simple uniform, stretched his limbs before stepping out. "Name's Carter," he said with a grin. "Try not to break me." Some students chittered in amusement, but others remained skeptical. A reptilian student from the Draxian Empire spoke up, his voice sharp with doubt. "Is it true that humans can function with severe injuries? We have read reports of your kind surviving wounds that would kill even the hardiest of species." Dr. Exerol's mandibles twitched. "Let us find out." The examination began with basic scans. The students observed the human's biological structure, noting the odd redundancies: 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, a liver capable of regeneration. "This is inefficient," murmured a student from the binary-brained Olderon species. "Evolution would have streamlined such excess." But when they simulated organ failure in their analysis, they saw something astonishing: the body compensated. If one lung failed, the other expanded its capacity. If the liver was damaged, it repaired itself. The room filled with murmurs as the students exchanged glances of disbelief. But that was only the beginning. When exposed to minor toxic elements, the human merely coughed and shook his head. "That's it?" one of the students asked. Carter smirked. "You should see what happens when we drink alcohol." The students moved on to pain tolerance, a test designed to measure sensory thresholds. A mild electrical pulse, which would have sent most species into distress, barely earned a wince from the human. Increasing the intensity, they found his reactions unpredictable. "He should be incapacitated by now," a student remarked, adjusting the controls. But Carter simply clenched his jaw and exhaled through his nose. "We get used to pain," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. Dr. Exerol observed carefully, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the data streams. "Human pain tolerance is not just biological," he mused. "It is psychological. They endure because they choose to." That revelation unsettled the class. Most species had built-in safety mechanisms. Pain was a warning, a command to cease harmful activity. But humans overrode that instinct. They kept moving forward, regardless of the cost. Determined to find a limit, the students conducted a simulated high-gravity test, replicating the pressures of extreme planetary conditions. Many species would have collapsed under the strain, their muscles locking, their blood circulation failing. But Carter simply adjusted, his breathing slowing, his stance widening to compensate. "Your skeletal structure should not withstand this," one student muttered, watching the readings. But it did. The bone density of humans, normally unremarkable, adapted under stress. The more pressure exerted, the stronger it became over time. Their bodies evolved mid-struggle, another student whispered in disbelief. Carter rolled his shoulders. "We call it training." The final test was psychological endurance. A holographic simulation was engaged, presenting Carter with a series of escalating stress scenarios: starvation, lossation, loss. Many species, even the strongest warriors, broke under such conditions. Panic set in when survival seemed impossible. But the human did not panic. He calculated. He adapted. He found solutions. When faced with the scenario of being stranded without food, he scavenged for nutrient. When isolated in total darkness, he relied on memory and rhythm to navigate. When confronted with loss, he grieved, but then he moved on. The students who had expected desperation saw something different. Determination. At last, the test concluded. The students gathered, their preconceived notions shattered. A being that should have been fragile had proven to be the toughest organism they had ever studied. Dr. Exerol turned to Carter, his voice thoughtful. "What makes you this way?" Carter considered the question before answering. "Because we have to be. Our world was never kind to us. It threw disasters, predators, wars, and disease at us. If we gave up, we wouldn't be here." The silence in the room was heavy with understanding. Humans were not the strongest, nor the fastest, nor the most intelligent. But they endured. They suffered and kept going. They failed and tried again. In the grand theater of the cosmos, where logic and biology dictated survival, humans had rewritten the rules. As Carter stepped back into the containment pod, ready for transport back to his ship, he turned to the students with a grin. "Good luck out there," he said. "And if you ever get into trouble, find a human. We're hard to kill." The doors sealed shut, and the students watched in silence as the pod was taken away. Dr. Exerol finally spoke. "Lesson complete. Class dismissed." But none of the students moved, because they had just learned something they would never forget. The medical students of Zalvex 9 gathered in the research chamber, their minds filled with theories, calculations, and countless studies of alien physiology. They had examined beings of metal and gas, creatures with regenerative crystalline structures, and species that could survive in the vacuum of space. But today, they faced something entirely different. The containment pod in the center of the room slowly opened, releasing a cool mist that curled around the feet of the gathered students. Inside stood a human, an unremarkable-looking bipedal figure with a confident smirk. "So, who's poking me first?" The human, designated as Carter, asked, his voice casual despite the weight of the moment. The lead instructor, Dr. Exerol, a towering insectoid with gleaming mandibles, clicked his claws together. "You, subject, are an enigma. We will uncover why." The students activated their scanners, expecting to see something simple, something explainable. But what they found made no sense at all. The first anomaly they detected was the redundancy in human organs. 2 lungs, 2 kidneys, a liver that could regenerate, and a heart that could continue beating even after significant damage. The Draxian student, whose own species had a single, massive cardiovascular core, hissed in confusion. "This is wasteful design. Why would evolution allow such inefficiency?" Dr. Exerol studied the data, his multifaceted eyes reflecting the streams of medical readings. "It is not wasteful," he murmured. "It is survival." The students continued their scans, uncovering layers of complexity they had not anticipated. The human nervous system had redundancies, allowing signals to bypass damaged areas. The muscular structure was highly adaptable, strengthening with repeated stress. Even the bones, which should have been fragile compared to exoskeletal species, showed an ability to grow denser under pressure. The more they examined, the less they understood. Determined to test these findings, they moved to controlled experiments. The first was a simulation of toxic exposure. A carefully measured dose of a neural suppressant, designed to sedate most biological species, was administered. The reaction should have been immediate muscular failure, unconsciousness, and complete system shutdown. Instead, Carter blinked, rubbed his arm, and yawned. "You guys trying to put me to sleep?" he asked, seemingly unaffected. The students double-checked their instruments, certain they had made an error. They increased the dosage slightly, enough to paralyze a creature twice his size. Carter stretched, rolling his shoulders. "Feels kinda warm," he noted. Dr. Exerol's mandibles twitched, a rare sign of astonishment. "His body is metabolizing the toxin before it can take effect. This should not be possible." The students muttered among themselves, struggling to make sense of what they were seeing. Next, they tested physical endurance. Carter was subjected to high-gravity simulation, a setting that caused many species to collapse within seconds. The students watched as his body adjusted, his breathing slowing, his muscles resisting the crushing weight. Human bones should fracture under this pressure, one of the students noted, checking the readings. But instead of breaking, the density of his skeletal structure increased. "It's adapting," another student whispered in disbelief. When the gravity was returned to normal, Carter shook out his limbs and smirked. That was a workout. The class was silent, their minds racing to comprehend what they had just witnessed. The final test was thermal resistance. A controlled simulation of extreme cold and heat was introduced, conditions that would force most biological beings into hibernation or shutdown. Carter shivered in the cold but did not collapse. His body trembled, muscles contracting rapidly, generating internal heat. Shivering reflex, Dr. Xirol explained, watching with fascination. A primitive but effective survival mechanism. When exposed to intense heat, his skin glistened with sweat, his respiration increasing, releasing heat from his body. Evaporative cooling, another student murmured, realizing that the human was not merely enduring the conditions, he was regulating himself to survive them. No external bioadaptations, no thermal armor. Just internal adjustments. By now, the students were no longer simply studying the human. They were in awe of him. Every test, every examination, revealed something more impossible than the last. One of the reptilian students hesitated before speaking. "What is the evolutionary purpose of this? Why does your species have so many ways to resist death?" Carter leaned forward, his expression thoughtful for the first time since the experiments had begun. "Because we had to." The room was silent as he continued. "Earth wasn't kind to us. It threw diseases, disasters, predators, and wars at us. The weak died, the strong adapted. We didn't grow armor or develop venom. We just learned how to survive. No matter what." Dr. Xirol stepped forward, his gaze locked onto Carter. "Then tell me this, human. If your kind is so resilient, if your bodies can withstand so much, what is your greatest weakness?" Carter was quiet for a moment before he smiled. "Our minds." The students exchanged confused glances. Carter tapped the side of his head. "We survive things we shouldn't. We endure pain and suffering. But sometimes, we don't break on the outside, we break on the inside." There was a heaviness in his voice, a weight that even the alien students could recognize. Dr. Xirol studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then that is what makes you truly unique. A species that can survive anything, except itself." The lesson ended, but the students did not immediately leave. They remained seated, processing what they had just learned. Humans were not the strongest species, nor the fastest, nor even the most intelligent. But they were the toughest. They did not rely on armor, nor specialized organs, nor external adaptations. They endured, adapted, and continued forward, no matter the odds. And that, the students realized, was the most impossible thing of all. The research facility of the Exilari Dominion was known across the galaxy as the ultimate testing ground for endurance. It had witnessed species with hardened exoskeletons, creatures that could regenerate lost limbs, and beings that felt no pain at all. But today, the scientists had something different, something that should have been fragile, weak, and easy to break. A human. The subject, designated as Captain Elias Carter, sat in the middle of the observation chamber, his expression calm despite the restraints around his wrists. His breathing was steady, his eyes sharp as he studied the beings surrounding him. Dr. Veckrol, a towering reptilian scientist with shimmering black scales, narrowed his eyes. "Let us begin," he announced, signaling his assistants to activate the first test. The first experiment was a standard pain threshold assessment. A controlled electrical current was applied to Carter's arm, increasing in intensity with every second. Most species would react by the second phase. Muscles would convulse, pain signals would overwhelm their nervous system, and they would cry out or submit. But Carter barely flinched. The current increased further, reaching a level that should have been unbearable for any organic being. The XLRE scientists leaned forward, expecting a reaction, but Carter simply clenched his jaw and exhaled through his nose. "Is that all?" he muttered. The researchers exchanged confused glances. Dr. Veckrall increased the intensity one final time, pushing beyond what was considered safe. Carter let out a sharp breath, but did not break. He lifted his gaze toward his captors, a small smirk forming on his lips. "You're going to have to try harder than that." The scientists halted the test, perplexed. Pain tolerance was common in some species, but this was different. Humans were not armored, nor did they possess natural pain inhibitors. And yet, Carter had resisted levels of pain that would have incapacitated most warriors. Dr. Veckrall moved to the next phase, thermal endurance. A section of Carter's arm was exposed to sub-zero temperatures, followed by sudden, intense heat. The process was meant to induce extreme pain. His body trembled from the cold, his skin reddened from the heat, but he did not break. "Your body should be shutting down," one of the scientists remarked, checking the readings. "This level of stress should have overwhelmed your nerves." Carter shrugged. "We get used to it." The XLRE were beginning to understand. Humans did not simply resist pain. They adapted to it. Every increase in intensity, every new test, did not weaken him, it only made him more prepared for the next. Dr. Veckrall was growing frustrated. "Enough physical tests. Let us see how strong you are mentally." He activated the psychological resistance trial. A powerful neural stimulator was placed on Carter's head designed to break the strongest minds. It created illusions of isolation, despair, and fear, visions of failure, of loved ones lost, of hopeless situations with no escape. The machine had shattered warlords, crushed the spirits of entire species. But Carter simply closed his eyes. The scientists watched the readings, expecting signs of distress. Instead, they saw stability. Carter's heart rate remained steady, his neural activity sharp and controlled. "He's resisting the simulation," one of the assistants whispered. "This is impossible." Inside the illusion, Carter saw shadows moving, heard voices from his past whispering doubts, pain, and regret. But he had faced worse. He had been on battlefields where the screams of the wounded never stopped. He had seen friends fall, had felt pain that no machine could ever replicate. This was nothing compared to reality. He focused, slowed his breathing, and reminded himself, it's just a test. The illusion wavered. The machine attempted to amplify its effects, to drive his mind to the breaking point. Carter opened his eyes, unaffected. "Nice try," he muttered. Dr. Veckrall was no longer just studying Carter. He was unsettled by him. "How?" he asked, his voice low. "How do your kind endure this?" Carter met his gaze, unshaken. "Because we have to." He leaned forward slightly. "Pain doesn't stop us. Fear doesn't control us. We survive because we refuse to break." The scientists were silent, their previous confidence shattered. Every species had limits. The strongest warriors, the most advanced beings, they all had thresholds that, once reached, would force them to surrender. But humans? Humans just kept going. The XLRE Dominion had taken countless prisoners over the years, studying the strengths and weaknesses of many species. But for the first time, they realized that they had no real way of breaking this one. The human was not the largest, nor the most powerful, nor the most physically advanced. And yet, in the face of their most intense tests, he had not faltered. Dr. Veckrall turned away from the console, his mind racing. He had always believed that pain and fear were the ultimate weapons. But today, he had encountered something even stronger, the unyielding will of a species that refused to surrender. As the restraints were released, Carter stood, rolling his shoulders as if the entire experience had been nothing more than an inconvenience. He looked at the gathered scientists, a knowing smile playing on his lips. "I hope you learned something today." Without another word, he walked out, leaving the XLRE to question everything they thought they knew about endurance. The Galactic Council had gathered on the floating station of Varlon 7, deep within neutral space. Representatives from dozens of species sat around the massive circular chamber, all focused on the center where the latest research had been displayed. A massive hologram showed a rotating image of a human and ordinary-looking creature by galactic standards. Yet, Despite their frail appearance, humans had defied every logical expectation of survival. They had no claws, no natural armor, no venom, no extraordinary speed or strength, and yet they thrived in the most hostile conditions. The question had haunted the greatest minds in the galaxy: why? Dr. Kethar of the Exilari Dominion, a scientist renowned for his studies on survival mechanics, stepped forward. His scales shimmered under the artificial lights as he addressed the assembly. For centuries, we have studied resilience in different species, yet none puzzle us more than humans. They are weak, and yet they endure. They suffer, and yet they fight. They face extinction, yet somehow they always return stronger. Today, we may have found the answer. The room fell silent. Every representative leaned in, waiting for the long-awaited explanation. The Exilari had spent years capturing, testing, and analyzing humans to uncover what made them so difficult to eliminate. After thousands of trials, they had finally identified the most baffling truth. The first test had been physical endurance. The humans had been subjected to extreme conditions: freezing cold, unbearable heat, high gravity, and oxygen deprivation. Every other species tested had succumbed at predictable limits, but the humans? They adapted. Their bodies grew stronger, their lungs expanded, their muscles repaired faster. When deprived of food, they rationed their energy. When denied water, their bodies retained moisture. Their pain threshold was unmatched, allowing them to keep moving when others would have collapsed. But the real secret, Dr. Kethar realized, was not just in their bodies. It was in their minds. The second experiment focused on psychological endurance. The scientists created simulations of despair, loss, and hopelessness, believing that humans would surrender when faced with impossible odds. What they found instead was even more terrifying: humans did not break. They suffered, yes. They grieved, they bled, they cried, but then they got back up. Again and again. Other species, when overwhelmed by despair, simply gave in to fate. But humans? They refused to accept defeat. In one experiment, a human was placed in a simulation where all hope was lost: his home destroyed, his allies gone, his situation utterly unwinnable. Any logical being would have surrendered. But the human kept going, fighting against a battle he could not win, simply because he believed there was still a chance. And when there was no chance left, he created one. Dr. Kethar turned back to the council, his voice steady but filled with unease. Humans have something no other species possesses: a defiance of reality itself. When the universe tells them it is over, they simply refuse to accept it. They call it hope, determination, resilience, but I believe it is something deeper. It is an instinct to fight, no matter the odds. The room was silent. The leaders of the most powerful empires exchanged uneasy glances. The Exilari had captured humans, studied them, tortured them, and still the humans had emerged stronger. They had been pushed to their breaking point, yet they had refused to break. The evidence was undeniable. History itself proved the point. The ancient records showed that humanity had faced disasters that should have wiped them out: global wars, plagues, famine, and destruction beyond imagination. And yet, they had survived. They had lost billions, watched their world burn, and still they had rebuilt. Even in space, when their ships were torn apart, when their colonies were attacked, humans did not surrender. They kept fighting, kept pushing forward, kept surviving. The galaxy had seen powerful empires fall. It had seen species go extinct. But humanity? They refused to vanish. The final piece of evidence had come from direct observation. A human soldier had been captured during a border conflict and subjected to interrogations designed to break even the strongest warriors. He was isolated, deprived of sleep, starved, and tormented. His captors believed he would beg for mercy. Instead, he smiled. "You think this is enough to break me?" he had said. "You have no idea what we've been through." And he was right. Humanity had suffered more than any species in history, yet they were still here. The soldier never gave them the information they wanted. He withstood everything and, when given a chance, escaped, leaving behind a message scratched into the metal. The battle had been over before it even truly began. The Darathian Empire, one of the most feared warfaring species in the galaxy, had launched a sudden attack on the human colony of Epsilon 4. They had expected an easy victory. After all, humans were a young species, barely a century into deep space travel, lacking the vast fleets and planetary defenses that older empires possessed. The Darathians had conquered hundreds of worlds, crushing resistance with sheer firepower and ruthlessness. To them, Epsilon 4 was nothing more than another target, a simple conquest that would take no more than a few hours. But they had made a mistake. A mistake they would never forget. When the Darathian warships arrived, they found the colony barely defended. A few orbital defense platforms fired weakly at their ships before being swiftly destroyed. Ground forces landed unchallenged, storming through the colony's streets with ease. The humans had not even attempted to fight back. The invaders laughed at their weakness, pushing further into the city, expecting the humans to surrender completely. But something was wrong. Too easy. Too quiet. Where was the resistance? The Darathians had studied human history. These creatures were known for fighting, for resisting against impossible odds. And yet, here they did nothing. It was unsettling. Then, the first explosion happened. A Darathian command outpost, hastily set up in the heart of the city, erupted into flames. A perfectly timed detonation, collapsing the surrounding buildings, trapping dozens of soldiers inside. Panic spread through the invaders. The humans had planted explosives before the invasion had even started. And that was just the beginning. Hidden snipers began picking off officers. Small hit-and-run squads struck isolated patrols before disappearing into underground tunnels. Every time the Darathians regrouped, another explosion would tear through their ranks. Communications were jammed, their supplies were cut off, and their forces were thrown into chaos. Commander Xeral, leader of the Darathian invasion, watched in growing frustration. "They are cowards," he growled, slamming his clawed hand onto the command table. "They refuse to face us directly." But the truth was far more terrifying. The humans were not running. They were teaching them a lesson. Every time the Darathians thought they had secured a position, the humans would strike, then vanish again. They used the environment, their knowledge of the terrain, their sheer unpredictability. They fought with no honor, no pattern, no mercy, just an overwhelming determination to win. By the third day, the invaders were no longer the hunters. They were the hunted. Morale plummeted. Soldiers were afraid to sleep, knowing that the moment they closed their eyes, a human blade might find their throats. They were afraid to eat for fear that the food had been poisoned. They were afraid to breathe because every breath could be their last. The mighty Darathian army, which had crushed countless civilizations before, was now a desperate, paranoid force, trapped, cut off, and bleeding. And then came the final blow. A message, broadcasted across all their channels, spoken in a calm, almost mocking human voice. "You thought we would surrender. You thought we would kneel? You know nothing about us. You should have learned from history. You should have known humans never give up. We don't fight fair. We don't stop. And now you will never forget." That night, the humans struck with everything they had. Guerrilla fighters emerged from the shadows, planting explosives, cutting down their enemies with brutal efficiency. The Darathians tried to retreat, but their ships had already been sabotaged. One by one, their remaining forces fell. The last surviving officers sent desperate distress calls to the Empire, begging for reinforcements. But none would come. The Darathians had underestimated their enemy, and now they were alone. By the end of the week, the once proud invasion force was gone. The humans had wiped them out completely. No prisoners. No survivors. Only wreckage and ashes remained where the invaders had once stood. When the Darathian Empire finally received word of the disaster, it was already too late. The lesson had been carved into history. You do not invade humanity and expect to leave unscathed. For the first time in its long history, the Darathian Empire hesitated before launching another attack. Fear had been planted in their minds, fear of the species that had turned their own invasion into a massacre. From that day on, no one in the galaxy would ever see humans the same way again. Because they had learned a lesson they would never forget.